Sound check. Kirsten or Eva will tell me whether or not there's a problem. But I want to welcome everybody today to our HHEI Undergraduate Research Showcase. I'm the director of Heller-Hurwicz, and I'm pleased to be moderating this session. We're going to have 5 students talking today. These 5 students, along with other classmates, we had a total of 12 altogether this year, were research assistants for our faculty, and they're going to describe the work that they've been doing. The way this is going to work is we'll have videos. There will be some videos. They range from 3 to 9 minute videos. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have the students come on and do a Q&A. So the way this works, for those of you who are new to Zoom, there will be a way to raise your hand, and then Kirsten will help us bring in the audio so that you can ask a question of the students. We're going to start with Asma Niam, and she's going to be talking about, okay, I'm looking to see if Kirsten's going to pop up her slides. But in the meanwhile, she's been working with Professor Hannes Malmberg, and the project they've been working on is educational spending in colonial Africa. Okay, take it away. So Kirsten, I'm going to, we cannot hear the sound or see it's racing through the video.
Yeah, we're just having a quick audio issue, but let's take care of it, and then we should be able to have sound.
Okay, well, while we're waiting, let me just say that up on hhei.umn.edu, we also have a video, not that you should look at it now. Oh, sorry, we're back.
We'll try again.
Okay.
Hi everyone, my name is Asma, and I've been working with faculty member Hannes Malmberg for the past year within the Heller-Hurwicz department. In this video, I'll be talking a little bit about my research experience, some of the questions that we are exploring, and how my data collection will help answer those questions and how we went about collecting this data. Before we get into our hypothesis and research, I just want to highlight some key information. During the 20th century, there has been a massive increase in schooling, a decrease in fertility rate, and decrease in mortality rates. It is observed that some of these trends are driven by increase in average income, but we also factor in that the social outcomes improve faster than would be predicted by income alone. We can see this by the fact that poor or developing countries today have higher schooling, lower infant mortality rate, and lower fertility rates than when rich countries were at comparable income levels. One hypothesis is that the disconnection between income and social measures is that government policy shifted towards prioritizing social services higher in the developing world. These shifts reflected both newly independent nations' willingness to invest more in their own populations, as well as the need for colonial powers to build legitimacy. So my work has been to document how spending on education evolved in African colonies prior to independence. Publicly available data starts in 1950, but we are interested in finding how much spending increased prior to this. Some countries of our interest are Gold Coast or Ghana, Kenya, Malawi, Uganda, Tanzania, and Nigeria. The data that exists within British archives is within the form of handwritten or often printed books dated back to the 1800s with information on education, such as enrollment, gender of the students enrolled, school fees, expenses, and the contribution of government versus missionaries. Along with education data, I help collect data within expenditure and revenue reports from the books as well, which detail figures on education expenses as compared to other governmental expenses. The process of getting this data readable and of use to us was long and very detail oriented. The books have other information besides education and expenditure, so I would find the relevant pages and download copies of those. Initially, I made samples of what an ideal Excel spreadsheet would look like with data that can be transported to another statistical software for further analyses. Since then, my work has been largely focused on supervising a team of freelancers who extract the data and copy it to Excel. Once we get it on Excel, I scan and check it for consistency and ensure it's all making sense together. The format of the books changes by year and country pretty drastically, so I have to adapt and give new instruction and feedback pretty frequently. I've really enjoyed exploring data and information that isn't traditionally found online and is in its rawest form. This has been a pretty new experience for me and has also served as a great leadership role within this research assistant position. I have always enjoyed partaking in projects that demand attention to detail and digging through layers of information to find what we need, and this project has been exactly that for me.
Thank you, Asma. Now we're going to bring her on and we'll have her take questions.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for listening on. If you have any questions for me, I'll be happy to take them. I'm happy to talk about my experience with historical data further if anyone's interested in that as well.
We're just waiting for someone to be brave and raise their hand.
There are brave people in the chat room. Okay.
Hi, Patrick here. I was just curious, so seems like you've done quite a bit of data work on this already. Are there any like early patterns that you've observed or, early preliminary data findings relating to the spending on education in these colonies?
Yeah, one thing that I began noticing before we even imported it to any other statistical software was there were two forms of spending. Some was coming from the government side, and a lot of it had to do with like missionaries. There were some Islamic schools, there were some Christian churches that were spending in Kenya or Ghana. And it was actually really difficult because we had to figure out a way to turn it into a numerical data form because they would just write comments on the side that this was from the missionaries or this was government spending. So that was one thing that we had to look out for, that this was either government spending or this was from the missionaries. So that was really nice to see. And one other thing that I noticed that was very blatant was the gender ratio. There were obviously more male enrollment within the schools as opposed to female enrollments, but it did drastically change over time. So from 1800s to the late 1900s, it did, the female enrollment did increase. So those were some of the things that I could see with just my eyes as opposed to taking it into a software.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
Hi, Asma. It's really cool what you've been doing looking at this data. Are there any policies that you think could be implemented in the future to kind of increase education and increase education equality in these different countries?
Yeah, definitely. I think that they are already being implemented still, because with time I've seen that education has increased just with like the raw numbers that I've been seeing. In the 1800s, it was kind of like the total enrollment was 100, and then it was increased with like 50s. And I think that the just the papers that I was reading first, it started off with like the British government took interest, or the English government took interest and wanted to increase education within those countries. And I think it's just the policies have to come from the government themselves, because it started off with a missionary interest, but it wasn't enough. And then when the government started spending, that's when the education increased. So I think the policy has to be from a government ground base.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Asma. Great work, and keep up the good work. Next, we're going to have Sam Jordan Wood. Kirsten's going to put up some slides, who's going to be looking at declining business ownership in the US.
Hello, my name is Sam Jordan Wood. I'm a research assistant for the Heller-Hurwicz Economics Institute, specifically working with Professor Anmal Bhandari and Professor Ellen McGrattan. Today, I'd like to share a little of my research with you guys. What I've been looking into is the declining rate of business ownership in the US. Some of you may have seen this well-known graph of US firm startup and death rates. As you can see, between 1990 and 2005, startup rate remains relatively consistent, around 10.5%. However, between 2005 and 2009, it plummets from 10.5% all the way down to 8%. Today, I'd like to offer a few explanations for why this fall in the startup rate occurred. The first is that there's a larger draw from paid employment. And the second, which we'll dive more deeply into, is that there's higher uncertainty in the markets. Larger draw from paid employment. A big reason people choose self-employment is because of non-pecuniary benefits or non-income related benefits. Things like working from home or flexible hours. However, recently, we've seen larger corporations start to offer these benefits to paid employees. And so this could be a reason why more people are choosing paid employment. However, the drop was pretty substantial. And so I think a more plausible explanation is that there's higher uncertainty in markets. And we're going to look into why certain groups are less likely to start businesses in high periods of uncertainty, specifically older people and college graduates. But first, we're going to need a data set. The data set that I choose to use is the Survey of Income and Program Participation, or the SIP data set. This is a panel data set from the US Census Bureau. I used the 2004 and the 2008 data sets. Each contain 3 years of data. The first step was gathering the data and reading the proper documentation. There's a lot of information about all the variables and how the data works. And since it's a microsample, it has monthly observations of individuals. And it provides both core and topical models. Core models are variables that are provided every month, while topical models are variables that are provided yearly or bi-yearly. The next step is identifying the important variables. This is a data set of about 5.6 million observations and 1,022 different variables. So the data set is very large, and it's important to trim that down so it's easier to use and takes up less space. And so for me, those important variables were things like sex, race, age, education, and variables relevant to businesses and income. And so the next step was to ready the data for analysis. And one example of how I did this is that self-employment is not a variable in the data set. In order to determine whether people were self-employed, I first filtered down to people who said they owned a business. And then I compared how many hours a month they worked in their business versus their job. And if they worked more hours in their business, I classified them as self-employed for that month. Then I totaled up their self-employment for the year. And if they had 3 or more months of self-employment for the year, I classified them as self-employed. So that's just one example of how I had to manipulate the data to come to a conclusion. And so now that we have the data, we're ready to start looking into, why this startup rate fell between 2005 and 2009. So let's first look at the age breakdown. Here's the 2005 breakdown of employment type by age. The columns are age categories, and the rows are the percentage of people in paid employment and self-employment. So as we'd expect, younger people are less likely to be self-employed than older people because they have less experience, less education. But we're here to compare 2005 to 2009. So let's get the 2009 up there. And as you can see, every age group is less likely to be self-employed in 2009 compared to 2005. Each falls about 1 or 1.5%, except for the 2 eldest age groups. The 46 to 55 age group falls about 2.5%, and the 56 to 66 age group falls just over 3%. So older people were most affected between 2005 and 2009. And why are older age groups less likely to be engaged in self-employment in 2009? Well, they're closer to retirement. We know that the retirement age, early retirement is 62, and full retirement is 66 or 67, depending on if you were born before or after 1960. But these people close to retirement are less likely to be engaging in small businesses because business ownership is risky. And so they're more likely to continue on in their paid employment as opposed to starting a business because they're closer to retirement and they don't want to take a risk, especially in financially uncertain times like the recession of 2008. They're also more likely to have debts, mortgages, and children. Children are expensive, and so are mortgages. And so people who have them and have these debts are less likely to be starting businesses and engaging in business ownership, especially in fiscally uncertain times. Now let's look into the education status of business owners. So self-employed people, 8% of high school dropouts are self-employed, about 10% of high school graduates are self-employed, and 15% of college graduates are self-employed. The comparative statistics, with 2009 show that every group is less likely to be self-employed in 2009. Each group falls about 1.5%, except for college graduates, once again, falls just over 3%, a very large decline. So why are college graduates less likely to be self-employed in 2009? Well, tuition rates have increased drastically in the last 20 to 30 years. And because of that, college graduates are more likely to have student loans, similarly to why older folks aren't engaging in business ownership. College graduates are less likely to be in business ownership and more likely to be going into paid employment because they have these student loans that they need to pay off and they don't want to take the risk, especially in a fiscally uncertain time. So that's kind of what I've been doing, looking into why the startup rate fell from 2005 to 2009. Something I'd like to look into more is, if we take a look at this graph again, why does the startup rate remain low? We know that the GDP of the US recovered by about 2012 or 2013, and yet the startup rate remains at about 8%, even in 2014. So that's something I'd like to look into more. I'd like to get the 2014 SIP data set and look to see if I can figure out why the startup rate persists at about 8%. I'd also like to utilize the panel aspect. Most of the data statistics that you saw today are cross-section, which means they are in one time period. The nice part about the SIP is that it offers people's observations over time. So I'd like to get more into using the panel aspect of the SIP, a little more complicated. And finally, I'd like to explore the changes in business value and debt between 2005 to 2009 to see if there are any interesting conclusions that can be had there. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please direct them at samjw25@gmail.com.
Sam, do you want to unmute yourself and maybe take some questions? Anybody have any questions for Sam?
Yes, I have a question. Sam, actually, I have two questions. The first one is you said that you had to identify self-employment based on data. I was wondering if you used different measures and how your results compare. And the second one is that you were stressing a lot uncertainty in the business environment, but there are two aspects when you start an entrepreneurial activity. One is expected return. So it might just be that businesses are less profitable, and the other one is uncertainty. And I don't know that you can distinguish between the two for that period. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I didn't really dive into switching the parameters of self-employment too much in my research, but that's definitely something that's interesting and could be looked into more. And I agree that with you that expected return and uncertainty, it's hard to differ between the two because in the time period following like 2008, both are certainly problems. And so you're right in that expected return and uncertainty could both be reasons that self-employment has dropped, because I think that the expected return for self-employment fell as uncertainty rose in that time period.
Yeah, that sounds good. Good job.
Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, great presentation, Sam. So it's known that after the 2008 financial crisis, that labor force participation rates dropped in the United States. You mentioned that among self-employed individuals, older people were more adversely affected by the Great Recession of 2008. Do we know if these people who were these older people who were self-employed, who were not self-employed, do we know if they went back into the labor force after they were no longer self-employed?
Yes, thank you for the question, Mr. Pickens. I think that the main switch was actually not from older people leaving self-employment, but rather people who were moving into that age category chose to continue their paid employment rather than switching into self-employment at that time because of the risk. They wanted to continue on with their secured paid employment jobs. So that would be my conclusion for the fall in the percentage of people self-employed in the older age groups.
Thank you, and nice job.
We've got Bob with a question.
Oh, sorry. The question is in the chat. The question is, did you consider venture capital formation over the period in question as an important variable? Yes, I have, capital as a variable in the data set. It's one of the variables that I've been meaning to dig into more, but at the moment it has not been looked into in depth. But that's definitely something that is very interesting and should be looked into. It's just more of an expansion from the research that I did, if that makes sense.
Hi, Sam. When you were talking about the panel aspect of the SIP, have you looked at transitions into and out of self-employment for, across the different months that you have in the SIP?
Yeah, so I have the SIP. So the 2004 SIP has 2004, 2005, 2006, and the 2008 has 2009, 10, 11, and 12. So for each transition period, I actually did calculate the number of people leaving self-employment and moving to paid employment and vice versa for each year. And as you'd expect, you see the number of people leaving self-employment is higher than the people leaving paid employment each year.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Sam. This was awesome.
Thanks, guys.
Next up, we have Jackson Miha, who is going to talk about investment and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
Hello, my name is Jackson Mejia, and I'm a research assistant for Amal Bhandari and Ellen McGrattan at the Heller-Hurwicz Economics Institute. Much of that research has revolved around the connection between the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and investment. I will present some of that work here today. I'd like to start off by talking through some of the key features of TCJA for corporate investment. First, there's a drop in the corporate statutory tax rate from 35% to 21%, which brings the US in line with most Western countries. It is the main driver of investment in the bill and is predicted to increase investment because it lowers the user cost of capital and therefore creates incentives to invest. On its own, this is predicted to increase investment around 10% annually compared to if the rate were 35%, based on standard estimates of the response of investment to changes in the tax rate. The second key feature is that there's a change from partial expensing to full expensing of certain types of investment. Averaging over all assets, this reduces the marginally effective tax rate for equity finance investment from 16% to 3%. However, it does introduce some timing distortions because this provision is set to sunset in 2022. The third key feature is that there's a change in the deductibility of interest from full deductibility to 30%. This increases the average marginally effective tax rate for debt finance investment from negative 64% to negative 48%. The fourth key feature has to do with international provisions. These are complex, but the overall effect is to increase the tax rate on investment for multinationals. Next, I'd like to talk through corporate investment in the 21st century. This chart shows non-financial corporate investment as a percent of GDP in that time frame, and as a standard picture. Investment goes up during boom periods and down during recessions. Typically, this is around 9.5%, meaning we spend around 9.5% of our income on investment. There are a few notable events here. So you can see recessions in 2001 and 2008, as well as the passage of TCJA in 2017. I'd like to zoom in on this TCJA period, look at what happened before and after. This is the same chart as before, simply zoomed in. Again, the blue line represents actual corporate investment as a percentage of GDP over the 2015 to 2019 period. Looking at only 2 years of data, 2018 and 2019, it isn't clear that TCJA had much of an effect, especially when we consider that standard macroeconomic models would have predicted investment as a share of GDP to be closer to 10% by now. However, the blue line shows that these projections were not particularly close to correct. Now, I think it would be useful to look at a couple of major corporations to get a more concrete image of what went on. First, let's take a look at Apple. In the table, we have the statutory tax rate, capital expenditures, and R&D for 2016 and 2019. Capital expenditures and R&D are both large components of corporate investment. Here, both are given as shares of cost of goods sold. Notice that while the statutory rate fell from 35 to 24.6 to 21%, capital expenditures went down substantially, while investment into research and development did go up. Even so, both categories seem to be continuing trends that pre-exist at TCJA to some extent. Now let's look at Woodward, a major aerospace manufacturer. Again, the statutory rates are the same, but in contrast to Apple, there is no clear trend to either capital expenditures or R&D, and there is no obvious effect of TCJA on either category. We see that capital expenditures and R&D both went slightly up in 2018, but then reached their lowest levels over the observed time period in 2019. What do we make of this? Why didn't our standard macroeconomic models predict what happened? Which leads to the following question: why did the projections fail? And I think there are three major reasons for this. The first has to do with current macroeconomic conditions, the second, policy uncertainty, and the third, the size of the cuts was not that large. We will briefly explore each in turn, starting with macroeconomic conditions. A basic macroeconomic model of the effect of a tax cut says that how effective it is depends on prevailing conditions. When the economy is strong, close to capacity, the marginal effect will be smaller. And when the economy is in a recessionary period, the cut will have a greater stimulative effect. With that in mind, note that macroeconomic conditions in 2017 were such that a tax cut probably would not do much to stimulate additional economic activity because the economy was already close to capacity. Unemployment was quite low at around 4%, and investment was already high relative to what it typically has been in non-recessionary times. This is something that economists have often remarked upon and is not innovative on our part. Next, let's think about policy uncertainty, where uncertainty is both economic and political. The idea is as follows. With greater uncertainty across time, corporations will be more willing to wait and see rather than undertake a costly investment, which is potentially irreversible and has adjustment costs if the decision turns out to be wrong. Around the time of TCJA, there were several factors increasing uncertainty in a way that would dampen investment. First, there was substantial uncertainty about the tax bill itself, which involved complicated changes to the tax code, particularly for multinationals. Second, there was a political dimension to the uncertainty. Around that time, the political environment was particularly volatile, and it was and remains unclear how persistent policy changes will be. In particular, many changes are easily reversible in 2020 if there's a switch in parties, or 2024. Second, and more importantly, there's impermanence built in the TCJA because it wasn't politically popular on both sides, which means that in the way it was passed, most provisions are set to sunset in the mid-2020s. Third, the existence of a trade war among global superpowers increased uncertainty about the future path of tariff rates, and the treatment of multinationals may have dampened investment. Finally, I want to talk about our contribution as a team, which is about the actual size of the cut. And it's where the majority of our research comes in. But first, a definition. The effective tax rate is the rate actually paid on pre-tax income. It is generally different from the statutory rate. The idea here is that the change in the statutory rate won't matter if there isn't a change in the effective rate. Our team parsed tens of thousands of 10K filings from the SEC's Edgar database with the goal of extracting firm-level effective tax rates, and we're largely successful in doing so. Based on our findings, the median effective tax barely fell from 18.5% in 2017 to 17% in 2018, and then rose again to 18% in 2019. The takeaway is that the effective rate didn't really change after the tax cut, which suggests why investment probably didn't change much either. This suggests a puzzle. Why didn't the effective rate change much? And there are two major hypotheses in my mind, although we could come up with more. The first is that after President Trump was elected in 2016, firms anticipated the cuts coming and adjusted their finances accordingly. The second, and to my mind, more compelling hypothesis is that there was a mini recession in 2015 to 16, which caused the effective rate to drop to 18.6% in 2017 from around 25% in 2015-16. The affected sectors drove down both the median and effective an average effective tax rate so that it fell substantially in 2017 as firms accumulated losses. This reflects the same pattern as other post-recessionary periods. Effective rates fell with profits. Taking all this into consideration, what are the implications for theory? What can we do better next time? What can we take away from this policy event? I think there are 3 areas ripe for revision within our macroeconomic models that would aid us in the future. First, I think political economy needs to be taken more seriously. A standard macroeconomic model called the real business cycle, or RBC model, uses shocks to things like productivity or taxes to help us understand how big of an effect a particular shock will have, using data from the economy to help guide or calibrate parameters in the model. One of the key parameters is persistence, or how long the shock will be expected to last. In this case, with a tax shock that has low persistence, both for political and economic reasons, it would have been useful and reasonable to apply that within the model. Doing so yields far more accurate results. Just a simple accounting of political economy would have gotten there, and I think could be useful in the future. Next, and I think this is more simple, I think it is important to be careful about applying analyses of previous tax events, regardless of whether and how much macroeconomic conditions were different at the time. For example, the White House Council of Economic Advisors used a meta-analysis of investment responses to tax rates, regardless of macroeconomic conditions, to generate their predictions. And I think this led to some issues and probably disappointment in the results. Finally, with respect to the size of the cut, it is important that economists and policy analysts in general consider effective rates rather than statutory rates, and that we have better, more accurate data on that front. Most economists performed well here, but because there does not seem to be adequate data on effective rates, they tended to overestimate the effects. In short, I don't think our theories are wrong, but they need to be better calibrated in application. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions, please email me at mahia069@umn.edu.
Great, thank you, Jackson. And Jackson is unmuting himself so he can take questions.
Hi, Jackson. It's Thomas. Can you briefly talk about why there's such a big difference between the statutory rate and the effective rate? What's going on there?
Well, one reason the major reason for the difference between the statutory and the effective rate is that there are a number of provisions in tax policy that allow corporations to either make deductions or take credits on a number of things within their tax bill, and we can do that as individuals too. But corporations will take advantage of these provisions to lower their tax bills, and it could be that they house much of their operations elsewhere, which would then yield a lower rate also.
Great, thanks. Great job today.
Thank you.
It looks like we had Patrick coming on and then popping off. Here he's trying again.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I was wondering if you had looked at the evolution of investment at the industry level. You mentioned the 2015-16 mini recession, which I know was specific to many or a select group of industries. And in particular, the energy and resource extraction industries might be particularly affected simply by the fluctuations in global commodity prices.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So I haven't looked beyond before 2015, but since 2015, it's been clear that investment has largely been driven by the energy sector, which as you say, was the major driver of the recession in 2015-16, and then also the major driver, that's what many analysts think, of the recovery in 2017, when the price of oil went up substantially. The recession also affected agriculture and manufacturing for other reasons, and related reasons too, I guess, but they were also major drivers of that.
Great, thank you.
Hi Jackson. I had a small question on different policies. So you have 2 years of data. My question is, suppose I were to take the average tax policy that I've seen in the US affecting multinationals, say since World War II, what on average tends to be a short run reaction to GDP growth and to investment rates? And have you noted how the previous policies seem to change things?
Yeah, so there have been a number of studies done on this, and the standard estimate for this is that a 1% drop in the user cost of capital leads to a 1% increase in investment. This is in the short run. In the medium term, it's slightly higher, and in the long run, it tampers down a bit, but still with a higher steady state growth rate. One issue is that oftentimes these tax events have taken place when macroeconomic conditions were such that a cut in the rate would be much more effective than it was in late 2017 when the economy is quite strong already. And so like if you use analysis from a time, say the 1970s, which there wasn't a cut, but in the 80s when there was a cut, it would present issues with the heterogeneous events.
Okay, great. Okay, that's a very good, interesting response. Phenomenal. And let's see how your work results evolve when you have more data. We can see how this evolves. Great job, by the way.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much, Jackson. Keep up the good work. We're going to move on now to hear from two students, Alex Janin and Nikhil Saxena. And they've been working with Professor Joe Mullins, and the team is studying welfare to work experiments. Turn it over to, actually, I think Joe, who starts this.
For our discussion of a structural meta-analysis of welfare to work experiments and their impacts on children. I'm Joseph Mullins. I was the lead investigator on this project, and my RAs here were Alex and Nikhil, and they're going to tell you about the research that we got up to this year. So take it away, Alex.
All right, thank you, Joe. So first of all, just to go over the framework, what a meta-analysis usually is it aggregates results from different experiments to estimate an average treatment effect across all those experiments. And what we did on top of that is we did the same thing across many experiments, but we used an economic model to sort of identify parameters of interest. And the key difference is that the differences in experiments are by nature different, and structural meta-analysis, what we did is we took that difference as key in our analysis, and we treated them as, the differences as revealing the preferences of agents in each experiment, whereas traditional meta-analysis sort of tries to control for that. And in doing this, we were able to estimate economic primitives that were useful, as you'll see later on. Nikhil.
So we synthesized findings from 5 welfare to work experiments to use in this structural meta-analysis across 16 different sites across the country. Because the policies used in the different welfare experiments will have different impacts on work, income, welfare use, what child care is used, and in turn, different child outcomes. So these were used to create economic models of labor supply and investment in children, which relate these treatment effects across the sites to different economic primitives, which allow us to create a counterfactual model to estimate what these effects would look like in a vacuum so that we can see what different policies could benefit future welfare programs.
And so what are the experiments we used? Well, we used a bunch of experiments that happened in the 1990s in different states, pre-Bill Clinton's 1996 welfare reform. States were given the latitude to sort of experiment on their own. And we took these 5 over here, as you can see, that happened in, I think, 11 sites across the nation. And they each had slight differences in how they implemented certain programs. And we used that in the structural meta-analysis as a useful indicator of, as a key indicator of, policy parameter estimation. And so these had different work requirements. Some gave more money to work, childcare subsidies, especially given that most of these participants were single parents. Childcare was an extremely relevant part of all of this. And some of them had work, had employment services, and some terminated after a specific time. So we exploited these differences when we estimated our model.
So for the first stage of the project, me and Alex read through a bunch of different reports published by the MDRC on all of these welfare experiments to collect the average treatment effects for all of these experiments and to find ways to codify some of the differences between the experiments into the economic model. So we can collect the data on the control and treatment groups and for welfare participation and child development outcomes, and how the treatments were implemented and how samples were selected so that we would make sure that that information was reflected in the model. So these were the direct inputs to the structural meta-analysis we mentioned.
Just as an example of the descriptive example of our data, what you're seeing here is labor force participation across all the sites for the treatment groups, those who are given the new experimental welfare program, and the control groups who were still under the previous pre-Bill Clinton federal program. And you can see that there are enormous differences across sites in labor force participation, which was the stated goal of many of these programs, to get more people out of welfare into work, to increase labor force participation. And sort of we exploited these differences, sort of served to motivate further investigation into just how effective each of these programs were. But here's a variation. On to you, Nikhil.
Here are some of the treatment effects that we can estimate from the counterfactual model that we're able to estimate using the structural meta-analysis. And we can see here's a couple of examples. For example, in this CT jobs first, this first box here, we can see that the effect of a time limit had, over the long run, a 10% decrease in participation rate of the subjects. But the time limit had very little effect on the labor force participation rate overall. And on the bottom here, we see the effect of the work requirements of these, which in this case was very erratic and had different effects at the different sites.
And the second sort of thing we want to highlight here with our counterfactual analysis is, what if we, as Nikhil said, in a vacuum, just gave $1,000 as a new welfare program. So a new welfare program just as $1,000 transfer. What does each $1,000 transfer do for child outcomes? Where on the left here, as in the previous slide, here we see the effect is the percentage of a standard deviation. Fraction of a standard deviation. And what we see here is $1,000 pretty clearly has a positive effect in child outcomes. And it seems to be more so for older children than younger children. And it's somewhere in the range of 0.02 to 0.04 of a standard deviation. So that's what the outcome would be if we gave $1,000. But if we had a work requirement as just another sort of counterfactual, that doesn't seem to be very useful at all. Most of these, as you can see on the bottom row, are not statistically significant from zero, where the lighter shaded areas are confidence intervals, and they seem to balance out if they're at all statistically significant from zero, suggesting that financial incentives are probably a better policy of interest if your goal is to improve human capital development for children.
Thanks, guys. And I'll just encourage you both to, we had a conversation about this prior to recording that I think you guys both made some insightful comments. Nikhil, you had one comment about the work requirement that, this was a big question about whether, this was a commonly used feature of welfare reform. And the big question is, does mothers going to work have negative impacts on kids? It kind of looks like the evidence is mixed here, but that, loosely speaking, what's happening is that the additional income being earned is countervailing or counterbalancing the loss in time at home and loss in time with the child in terms of academic achievement. If we go back to the previous slide, now, Alex, you made a point about the time limit that, I like the way you said it. These are called welfare to work programs. But if we impose a time limit, what it looks like is you get women off of welfare, but they don't necessarily go into work. By women, I mean, of course, single mothers who are the dominant participants in these programs. You have to have a child to be eligible. And yeah, I love the way you put it. So these are the sorts of things that we've been talking about and playing with, and both these guys were really helpful, not just in the first stage of doing the painful work of putting the data together, but also interpreting the findings. I think that will be a good place to wrap up. Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, I can't get my video to stay still. All right, thank you so much, Alex and Nikhil. Anyone have any questions for these guys? Besides Joe? I think there's one. I think you guys might have to look at the Q&A. There might be.
Yeah, I see a question by Jim. So just to sum it up, the effect of what we found, the effect of welfare to work policies was that they were great at getting people off of welfare, especially those that sort of had a time limit that forced people out of welfare, but they weren't so great at getting people into work, and they weren't so great at improving child outcomes in doing so, which is, I guess, depending on your goal, you might want to get people out of welfare and into work, but preserving future human capital outcomes. These experiments that had more draconian, I guess, or more stringent measures weren't great at doing that. By child outcomes, we measured those as academic achievement, as sort of certain behavioral outcomes like not getting suspended, average number of grades completed in high school. These sort of serve as a proxy for child outcomes in younger children. In older children and adults, we would measure human capital through years of schooling.
And another interesting effect that we found, which sort of contradict previous findings, was that other studies had found that work requirements would negatively affect child outcomes because they thought that a mother's not being at home always negatively affected child outcomes. But the counterfactuals that we found actually showed no significant negative, or it was a pretty neutral effect, the work requirements. So that doesn't necessarily support the idea that mothers working negatively affects child outcomes.
I think there's a question by Hannes who's.
Yeah. Hi, yes. I just wanted to ask about the effect of the cash transfer, the $1,000, 0.02 standard deviations. So I'm not really into this literature. Is that like a big effect, a small effect, or how do you think about that? And how does it compare to, say, like other early child interventions or like more direct spending on kids? So like how strong is this indirect effect compared to what we have found in more direct studies?
Thank you for your question. The effect is small. The effect is statistically significant. It's for a 95% confidence interval, but it is small. It's 0.04 of a standard deviation. And I would imagine that there are studies out there that show that direct spending in education probably returns more in terms of child outcomes than spending more on welfare to work programs. However, the point of welfare to work programs is twofold. Most policymakers want to get people out of welfare and into work, reducing pressure and federal on coffers and increasing labor force participation, tax rates, while at the same time minimizing the damage or or sort of controlling the effect on child outcomes. So child outcomes may or may not be a primary goal of these programs. In fact, they most certainly are not a goal. Most of them have the stated goal of getting people out of welfare and into work. And so what we found is that if the least damaging way or to do that while controlling for child outcomes is to give financial incentives rather than sort of more strict limits and policies that cut off after a point. The other thing is, one more thing that we might be interested in is the last couple of weeks have seen a huge expansion of the safety net as millions of folks have come out of the workforce and onto unemployment insurance. And hopefully none will stay, but there'll be a couple who stay as businesses close. Getting those folks out of welfare and into work requires the kind of thinking about how we design those programs that Professor Mullins, Nikhil, and I looked at in this study. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I think it's Jorge who might have a question. Maybe not. He's muted. You're muted. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, now he's gone. Okay. Well, I mean, in terms of time, we've done incredibly well for time. I'd like to thank the students. Maybe Kirsten can put all of them back online so you can see them one last time. They've worked so hard to prepare for this, not only as research assistants, but also learning how to do a presentation, which is never easy. Maybe these guys are going to be future professors and they'll be able to do presentations easily when here they come. Here's Asma and Sam. Sam, you want to unmute your video? And we're missing one. I think Jackson is missing here. But these guys have worked really hard. They're not in the background doing Netflix. They're in the background making their beautiful presentations. And they've been wonderful research assistants. And I encourage all of you to look at our website. There's going to be a video with all 12 of the RAs. They're going to be shorter clips than these, but have a look. And I want to invite everybody to next week's forum. We're going to be looking at the economics of COVID-19. Make sure to register if you're interested. And if there's any follow-up questions for our team, we're going to put up, here it comes, we're going to put up their emails. So please feel free to send them feedback if you didn't get to talk or ask a question. Please send them feedback. Here are their emails. And thanks everyone. See you next Wednesday. And thanks to all of you guys. Great job. I think it worked out really well. I mean, timing wise, and the Q&A I thought was really good. And thanks to Eva and thanks to Kirsten for setting all of this up. It's a hard job to coordinate these things, both the audio, the visual, few hiccups, but we're getting better at this. Yeah, lots of moving pieces. Anyway, thanks you guys. And thanks to your advisors for helping you out. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Hannes, if you're still on. Thanks, Anmol. And thanks, everybody else. And thanks to the audience. Very good work. Thumbs up.